Welcome to the Eliashib Archive. I'm your host, Zach. Today is going to be the first episode in a series called Armchair Archaeology. It's a much less scripted, much more informal series where I'm going to provide reactions to archaeological news and biblical studies, whether it be a reaction video to another content creator, something going on, or new discoveries in archaeology, just offering my thoughts, injecting my opinions into the conversation, and again, maybe helping to popularize some of the scholarship a bit. And also to foster conversation, clear up confusion. So I hope you enjoy it. Let me know down in the comments if you enjoy this sort of thing. Today we're going to be diving into the now famous, perhaps overwrought discussion between Wes Huff and Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan podcast. If you're not familiar with Wes Huff, he was a sort of not well-known Christian apologist on YouTube until his discussion with Billy Carson. And then he entered onto the Joe Rogan podcast where he made some claims that I think really apply to what this channel is designed to do, to discuss popularized biblical scholarship, particularly with respect to the Old Testament. Got a lot of reaction, and I think I have something to offer. I recognize the irony of bringing all 24 of my subscribers into this discussion with sort of titans of YouTube like Alex O'Connor and the like, but nonetheless, I think I have something interesting to offer, and I just can't resist a discussion of a textual criticism of the Old Testament on YouTube in the popular sphere. So I hope you enjoy the series. Welcome to the first episode of Armchair Archaeology. In Wes Huff's sweeping conversation with Joe Rogan, they covered a lot of topics, but one particular moment has garnered a lot of attention when Wes Huff made the following claim about the great Isaiah scroll at Qumran and the Old Testament.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the great Isaiah scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic Text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic Text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Now, this bold claim really clearly had an impact on Joe Rogan, as in later podcasts with other guests, he's kind of brought it back up and talked about it keeping him up at night, this verbatim transmission of Isaiah. This understandably bothered some skeptical commentators, and Alex O'Connor in particular had this to say.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600. Yeah. Now, most of these variants are small. They're differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there, which tells us that they were a later addition.
Now, Alex O'Connor brings up a lot of numbers. There's a lot of jargon used in this ongoing discussion, but the key issue is something called textual criticism. Now, you might not know what textual criticism is. You might, but in case you don't, texts are written, right? We have an original, presumably, and then they are copied by scribes over time. As they are copied, errors are made, and so you end up with different streams of text tradition because then that copyist makes a copy of a copy and a copy of a copy, so on and so forth. It's kind of like the game of telephone, or often our texts are accused of being like the game of telephone in that the final message is maybe not anything really like the original. But what scholars are able to do through somewhat of a scientific, somewhat of an artistic process, a lot of debates go on within the field of textual criticism, they're able to compare ancient manuscripts to each other. And through sort of reasoning, logic, the types of errors that might be made in the copying process can be ascertained, and we can reconstruct our best guess, certainly not a perfect guess, but our best guess of what the original text might have looked like. And that's at the heart of the discussion here. Is the original text of Isaiah more based on the Dead Sea Scrolls? Is the original text of Isaiah more like the Masoretic Text, which is what we base our modern Bibles on? What's the deal? Now, as we will see, the skeptics throw out a lot of numbers, and it's become a debate about how accurate is Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Masoretic Text, the Hebrew Bible. How similar is it? And I actually think, as I'm going to argue, this is a little bit of a distraction. I don't think that's actually what we should be focusing on, but nonetheless, that sort of is the key issue here. How similar is the modern English Bible that we have, which is, again, based on the Masoretic Text, to the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah? Now, after his reaction video, many Christian commentators on YouTube were a little frustrated maybe with Alex O'Connor, not just him, some other skeptical commentators, Kip Davis, Dan McClellan. I'm going to focus in on Alex O'Connor because I think he has the most interesting in the best critiques on this particular issue. Alex O'Connor appeared on Ruslan's podcast. Ruslan is a Christian commentator podcaster here on YouTube, and they had a conversation which I will admit was a bit frustrating. Alex O'Connor made the following point, which I do think is worth comment.
I wondered what you make of where we're up to, because as far as I can tell, what's happened is Wes Huff made a claim about the Isaiah scroll on Joe Rogan, which is not correct. He admitted that he was not correct, that he misspoke, but is still trying to salvage the point and indicate that Joe Rogan should still be amazed and would still be amazed if he heard the same thing. Now, I don't know if you've seen this, but just a few days ago, Joe Rogan had another episode. I can't remember who the guest was. It's Kip Davis who brought this to my attention. And right near the end of the podcast, Rogan says, I just posted on Twitter, Rogan says, I just had that Wesley Huff on. And something that I've been thinking about, I can't stop thinking about it, is that the Isaiah scroll that they found from like 1,000 years ago is verbatim the same as the one they've got today. It literally word for word. Like, I can't stop thinking about it. Now, I understand that people think that a sort of 93.5% at best fidelity with the Masoretic Text is still like really impressive. Yes, I mean, that's the calculation that Dan McClellan came to by assuming that every single textual variant only applied to one word, when actually they apply to sometimes entire sentences and verses. If you just ran down to one per word, then you get I think it's 93% fidelity. So it's got to be lower than that, but it's at best, 93%. People say that's still kind of amazing, but I don't think Joe Rogan would be having this other guest on going like, dude, I literally can't stop thinking about the fact that like the Isaiah scroll is like 93%. I just don't think it would have the same apologetic weight for him. So this is obviously doing something for him and his listeners that was a mistake that I called out. And in response to that, people are telling me that, I don't know, that I'm nitpicking, or that it doesn't matter, or that Wes Huff was essentially right all along. So I want to know where you stand on that.
He wouldn't have had an issue with it. I think the response to Joe Rogan is still, wow. I think the response is still the same. I think the information is still taken the same. And this is what I mean by we're splitting hairs over word for word in a conversational setting where, yes, again, conceded. He used hyperbole. He was in a 3-hour high-pressure situation. He said he misspoke. He said he should have said that. And he said why. Now, does that change the impact of the statement? Does that change the reality of the statement? I don't think it does. And this is where I think, yes, Wes was essentially right.
Okay, a few things to say. The first is that you keep saying hyperbole, and Wes has said this as well. This doesn't strike me as hyperbole. This doesn't strike me as, hyperbole I think is defined as like an intentional exaggeration of affairs. So if he was intentionally doing it, then I think that's quite bad. At best, it's an accident. It's like an accidental hyperbolic statement, which is just to say that he was incorrect. Like, to say it's hyperbolic might be that when it was 90%, he said it was 95. But to say, like, I think there is actually a category difference between like really, really correct and completely correct, no matter how really, really correct we're talking about. Like that 91 to 99% is, significant in various ways, but it's a category difference to saying it is word for word identical. I think it was just a mistake. And I think I would appreciate if people, including Wes himself, would stop dressing it up in the language of precision or hyperbole and just say, it was incorrect and I should have said this instead. It's not unhelpful, it's wrong.
Okay.
He makes the statement that there's a category difference between perfection and 99%. And I actually think that is a very useful observation and a meaningful critique of Wes Huff's statements. Ruslan didn't seem to quite agree. In the end, I think I land somewhere similar to Ruslan, as we'll see. Perhaps Alex O'Connor will also accuse me of trying to salvage Wes Huff's point and say he was essentially correct. But I actually agree with O'Connor here that Wes Huff is actually incorrect. It is not word for word identical. I think it's useful to point out that it is not word for word identical. Now, as an aside, Wes Huff did correct his statements to Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan said, Doesn't really matter to me. And Alex O'Connor got stuck on this partially because Joe Rogan was sitting with this piece of data. It's verbatim. Isaiah has been preserved verbatim for 1,000 years. Now, Alex raises, I think, the fair question: would it hold the same apologetic weight for Joe Rogan were it, 95% instead of perfection? And I actually think, yeah, it's a little bit, maybe a lot, less persuasive, right? If it's 100% every pen stroke where you would expect it to be, that seems to me to be like a pretty clear miracle over 1,000 years. I'm not sure how you could really argue against that. 93%, okay, now we've got some room to play in the gaps, right? We can argue against that a little bit. I still think it's remarkable, but there is a category difference. I think this is a useful critique from Alex O'Connor that some Christians haven't seemed to totally grasp, totally agree with. But I think it is actually a fair critique from Alex O'Connor. Where I start to depart from some of the skeptical commentary is with respect to the larger context of the discussion and the argument Wes Huff was clearly trying to make. I think if we put into context Joe Rogan's views of Christianity and the Bible, I think we can understand, okay, here's what Wes Huff was actually trying to say. He was certainly wrong in that statement. It was incorrect. It was misleading, unintentionally, obviously, but still incorrect. But the larger argument he was trying to make pertains to the Bible and its reliability more broadly, more generally, and not on the specific points that some of the skeptics are arguing. Joe Rogan is famous for his mistrust of Christianity, mistrust of the Bible. Joe Rogan's growing more friendly towards Christianity, at least. But on an older podcast, he made the following claims about the Bible.
I get confused with being an atheist all the time. I do not believe I'm an atheist. I believe I'm open to everything person. I don't believe stories about people coming back from the dead, and because they're written by people, right?
Yeah, man. I mean, that's right. And also they're supposed to function on more than the surface level. They're supposed to be a kind of fractal that has inside of it a lot of like symbols related to just human existence.
Yes.
They're not meant to be so much like taken literally. That's when you embarrass yourself on either side.
Exactly. On either side. That's a really good point. And the translations apparently are so difficult to do.
Yeah.
Apparently, especially Old Testament, when they translated the Old Testament, they had to translate it. I mean, think of all the different languages it had to go through. It was Latin and Greek and German and English and all these different languages that are so different. Like the way they structure sentences is different. So English doesn't just plug and play.
Right.
It's like sticking a USB 3 into a USB A. Like, hey, this doesn't really fit.
Right. Now add time. Add thousands of years and scrolls and like
kings who wanted things changed.
Yeah.
The King James version. What?
Right.
Who?
So in this context, we're not dealing with a slight difference in percentages of copy errors or spelling errors or even, a scrupulous scribe adding or subtracting one verse here and there. We're dealing with Joe Rogan claiming that the Bible is not trustworthy, it's not translatable, it's not even possible to do this. Kings and the church have corrupted it beyond imagination. Why even listen to it? So the claim then Wes Huff is trying to make is, hey, Joe, I know you've said in the past it's all just kind of made up and people could change whatever they wanted. 1Q Isaiah A, the Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, that has the whole book of Isaiah. It proves that is not the case, that there is actually a really reliable stream of copying going on here. Yes, there are some errors along the way. Yes, there are spelling differences. Yeah, there are even instances of a scribe dropping out an entire verse and a half, what have you. In a lot of cases, we can explain that away with textual criticism. In some cases, maybe we can't, but Joe Rogan's claim that the Bible is just the game of telephone, copies of copies, translation errors, corruption, isn't true. So, where does that leave us? First, I think believers can and should concede the point that Wesley Huff was flat out wrong. It is not word for word. It is not verbatim. He's explained why he messed that up. I think it's a fair slip up in a 3-hour conversation. Even the skeptical commentators have said, yeah, I understand why he slipped up. He's still wrong. And I think that's okay to say. He was wrong. When I was watching this, didn't even flinch. Again, as a Christian who's familiar with the world of apologetics, I'm used to this claim. Hey, the Bible isn't a copy of copies. We can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly Isaiah, pretty long book, is copied pretty reliably from, the Dead Sea Scrolls all the way 1,000 years later to the Masoretic Text. It's pretty reliable. That isn't what Wes said. I wish he had said that. I think that's a compelling case. I think saying something like it's remarkably reliable, it's really reliable, is a stronger case than word for word because it's more accurate, it's more correct. I think word for word can be a little bit misleading. I wish he would have made his case more precisely, more correctly, which he didn't, unfortunately, and it's become a bit of a distraction in the conversation. But I think it's actually good for Christians, good for people who believe in the reliability or the authority of the Old Testament to say, yes, this was a bad way to make that argument. Now, as far as the skeptical scholars, Alex O'Connor accused Ruslan and other Christians of moving the goalpost, right? We're moving the goalpost from word for word to, well, what he was essentially correct. Again, I think it's good to say that statement was incorrect, but I don't think it's moving the goalpost to try to salvage the larger point Wesley Huff was clearly trying to make to Joe Rogan, a noted skeptic online with a large audience, about the biblical text and its reliable transmission. The people who transmitted the Bible were concerned with doing so accurately in the vast majority of cases. Yes, we can talk about some interesting cases of scribes changing words or small parts of verses. I think that's interesting. We can salvage the originals from text criticism, as we've already discussed. That's an interesting discussion. What's not interesting, and what is a bit disingenuous, is I think the tone from some of these skeptics, especially Alex O'Connor's original video, kind of came across mockingly. I also think it's disingenuous to bring up these massive numbers in the thousands. Yes, that doesn't even include the orthographic, the spelling differences, but it does include some spelling differences. It does include some minor errors. It does include some using this preposition instead of that preposition. It does include, I accidentally dropped off a conjunction. It does include all of those. And it does include some minor omissions of even larger portions. Like a scribe can omit a verse and a half, 2 verses, because he had what's called a parablepsis. He looked from one word to the same word down a few lines and skipped copying the chunk in between. We can explain away a lot of these numbers, and I think the skeptics know that. That still leaves us with a portion we can have an interesting discussion about. For sure, what portion, I don't really know. I actually don't really think it matters. But I think it's a bit disingenuous to include these massive numbers to say, no, it's not accurate at all, because that's not the claim Wesley Huff was trying to make. Understand that's the claim he made? Good job correcting him. However, the claim he was trying to make is the Bible is pretty much reliably copied. Again, we can move the goalpost over to Jeremiah. We can discuss that. I think that would be an interesting discussion. Jeremiah, for those of you who don't know, at the Dead Sea Scrolls is 1/8 shorter than it is in the Masoretic Text. That's an interesting discussion. That's not what we're talking about. 1Q Isaiah A is good evidence that the Bible was reliably transmitted over 1,000 years. It wasn't word for word, but it's also not this hopelessly lost, thousands of errors. And I think it's misleading to change the discussion to a scholarly discussion of text criticism rather than a popular discussion of, hey, is the Bible made up? Was it corrupted over the centuries? I think 1Q Isaiah A is clear evidence to the contrary. I think it's clear evidence that the Bible was reliably transmitted, at least over that 1,000 years. And I think our reaction to the similarity between 1Q Isaiah A at Qumran and the Masoretic Text 1,000 years later indeed should be.
Wow.